Just imagine everything you touch turned to gold.
Gold. Sweet, sweet gold.
Well, that's what's happened with the housing market over the past 30 years. House prices have massively outperformed wages, so buying a property or properties has been basically like winning the lotto. Because first, you've had giant capital gains, and second, those gains are usually made at reduced tax rates due to generous housing policies. However, things are starting to change, and if you don't take notice, you might miss it. So whether you own a property or not, stick around because I'm going to consider if the golden era for housing is over. I'm Biko Konstantinos. If you're a fan of the original Star Wars trilogy, give this video a like. And if you think Disney's destroyed the entire franchise, why don't you consider subscribing to my channel? I'm into great movies that tell a story and make you feel something. Now let me tell you why I think the days of extraordinary gains on property are over. 30 years ago, housing was extremely affordable. At that time, you only needed one income per family to be able to easily afford a property and pay off that property in a relatively short period of time. In many places, house prices at that time were around 3 times the average wage, which is absolutely affordable even at higher interest rates. But then what happened? The credit market was relaxed and banks started allowing larger and larger loans, so people were able to borrow more and thus pay more. The majority of couples started both working so that most families became 2-income families. So when you're earning much more, you can borrow much more, and that leads to higher offers on housing, so the price rises. Now, another major factor was that housing policies benefited those who owned property. So more and more people started to notice this and took advantage of it by buying as many properties as they could. So this created more demand, which just feeds on itself, and the demand builds and builds. And if you look at this chart, you'll see why. With house prices growing in value so much more than wages, wouldn't you just do anything to buy a house and realize those extraordinary gains? Now, when you've had 30 years of this extraordinary growth, you end up with entire nations obsessed with property. And that's because it's become the easiest and safest way to build wealth. And in some countries like Australia, it's pretty much become a sure thing. But if you step back a bit and take a high level look, the golden era for housing really could be over. First, the days of cheap interest rates could be a thing of the past. Over more than a decade, central banks have been super loose with their monetary policies. It seems like they constantly want to stimulate the economy. They're constantly afraid of going into recession, so they're always reducing rates to keep it artificially low. But what this does, it stimulates the economy, but it's through debt, because debt is so cheap. Even before COVID, rates had been trending down for a long time, and they're a lot lower than their historical averages. But with COVID, rates went to zero and central banks went on a printing spree and flooded the economy with money. And one of the impacts of this ultra cheap money was to put a rocket under the housing market. So instead of us seeing the normal extraordinary growth of 6 or 7% per year, we basically saw growth of 15 to 20% annually for 2 years. But cheap money also means much more debt. And across the world, debt into property is at all-time highs. And the countries with the highest amounts of debt are the most at risk or exposed if interest rates stay higher for longer. So with predictions that inflation is going to stay relatively high for a longer period of time, interest rates could also stay higher. And now with the massive amount of debt, they don't even have to go that high to have a huge impact on the market. And we're already starting to see this as interest rates rise and house prices fall. Another huge factor going forward is just the price of housing at the moment. House prices are at record levels and have grown much faster than wages or inflation for many years. So houses in many places now are over 10 times the average wage. So this means for first home buyers, it takes many years to save up a big enough deposit for a home. And then it also takes a lot of years to start building equity into that home, especially if prices don't rise exponentially like they have been doing. So basically, house prices are just too expensive. How high do we expect them to go? 15 times the average wage? 20? The only way people have been able to keep buying properties at these levels is due to the super low interest rates. But now that could be a thing of the past, many people just won't be able to afford properties at these super high levels, and that includes investors. When house prices are rising strongly, investors can keep buying more and more houses because they keep gaining more equity. But if house prices decline or even stay flat for an extended period, it's much harder for investors to keep buying more and more properties. So for first home buyers, it's harder and harder to meet these super high prices, and that could put downward pressure on house prices for quite some time. Basically, wages would need to grow much faster than house prices for an extended period of time before housing becomes more affordable and more people can afford those prices. And wages outperforming property? That's sort of like blasphemy. It's just unheard of. The other big shift I'm starting to see is anger towards the inequality between property owners and non-property owners. As more and more people are not able to afford a home, they're fighting for government policies to serve them and not just property owners. Because property owners have the lion's shares of tax perks, they've been able to accrue so much more wealth than non-property owners. And this has created such a large wealth gap that everyone is starting to take notice, and it's suddenly now all throughout the media. Take, for example, the current rental crisis that's been seen around the globe. On one hand, we've got property owners who've seen 30 to 40% gains, but on the other hand, we've seen renters who are struggling to find a place, and if they do have a place, have seen their rent prices soar. And that's why in places like Australia, there's now calls to put a rental freeze in place to remove lucrative tax perks like negative gearing, to tax empty properties, and to give more rights and safety conditions for renters. Now, I can see more and more of these sorts of policies being proposed as the number of non-homeowners increases, and many of them getting pushed into poverty and some into homelessness. And if the government doesn't take some of these policies seriously, they could have a major societal crisis on their hands due to this wealth gap that's really opened up and those people that are most vulnerable in our society. So the landscape with changing housing policies could look much different over the next 10, 20 or even 30 years. Because just say the government didn't change any policies, with the amount of non-homeowners, they could help to elect other governments that they felt would better look after them. So if some of the perks are taken away from landlords or property owners, that could reduce overall demand for housing, which is another factor that could put downward pressure on prices. And what could happen over time is we could start to see fear enter the market. But just say you have a number of years of reducing prices or even flat, you could have more and more investors forced to sell. You could have more and more stories of people losing money on property, which just seems impossible. Or you could just see a number of years of property making the same amount of wages or inflation, so it's no longer the standout investment that it was for the past 30 years. It's just like the buy the dip phenomenon. If buying the dip has worked perfectly for 30 years, then people would just keep doing it and doing it and doing it. So house prices have fallen a bit, just buy. House prices fall a bit longer, just buy. House prices are flat for 3 years, just buy. It would take several years to get this just buy now type mentality out of housing. But it's a possibility and it's something we need to consider. Unemployment is another huge factor. We have extraordinary low unemployment at the moment, which means most people are employed and can afford to pay off their mortgages. However, if you look at the global economy, there's storm clouds ahead and there's really only one direction unemployment can go from here, and that's up. So if we start to see recessionary environment, unemployment rise, at the same time that inflation is fairly high and interest rates are high, that would put huge downward pressure on housing and could actually lead to a crash. Then central banks will try and reduce interest rates, but this time inflation could already be higher and countries can't afford for inflation to get out of control, which means they may no longer be able to stimulate their way out of an economic problem. Another very interesting macro factor is birth rate decline. Most developed countries at the moment have a birth rate that's not even above replacement population levels. Many countries make it up through immigration, but over time, this low birth rate will have an impact on housing. And with soaring costs and risks to the global economy, I don't see this low birth rate suddenly just jumping. Yes, so right now, there is peak demand for property in most countries, but that's not the same across the globe when you look at countries like China and Japan. Both of those countries have an oversupply of property, and when you have an oversupply, prices remain low. Japan is actually seeing a material population decline, and they're forecasting a huge amount of empty properties next year. So looking at the big picture over the next 30 years, declining birth rates in many countries could mean less demand for property. Technology is something many people may not have thought about regarding house prices. Everyone knows technology is increasing at a rapid rate across all areas of life, but we haven't really seen it impact housing as yet. But now you can 3D print an entire house. There's examples of robots assembling a house. So considering we have a housing affordability crisis, it stands to reason that people will be looking for technology to somehow solve that problem. Now, it won't be solved next year or even the next few years, but down the track, technology will be able to build houses much cheaper and much more efficiently. So have you taken a step back and look at some of these shifts across the globe that could massively impact the housing market for the next 10, 20, or even 30 years? So am I saying that housing will be a bad investment? Nope, definitely not saying that. It might actually be one of the better investments compared to others. But what I am saying is that the golden era of extraordinary growth could well and truly be over. And the King of the North might have been right when he said,
Winter is coming.
I'm Biko Konstantinos.